It began not with America, but with a weary British officer standing in the mud of the Western Front. The year was 1916, and Captain Peter Nissen watched thousands of soldiers sink knee-deep in filth beneath collapsing tents and leaking timber huts. The war had devoured everything: time, steel, labor, and the army needed shelter that could rise overnight and move with the front. Nissen sketched a half-circle of corrugated steel on a scrap of paper and, unknowingly, changed military architecture forever. The Nissen Hut was genius in its simplicity: 3 ribs of curved iron, lightweight sheets bolted together, and an arched roof that could deflect shrapnel as well as snow. It needed no skilled builders, no cranes, just 6 men, a wrench, and 4 hours of daylight. Within weeks, the first prototypes appeared along the Somme, grey shells shimmering with rain. Soldiers called them iron churches. They could house 50 men or serve as mess halls, hospitals, even chapels. By 1918, over 100,000 Nissen huts dotted the battlefields of Europe, Britain's quiet industrial miracle. After the armistice, the world forgot them, rusting in depots, sold for scrap or turned into farm barns. The huts waited for another storm. It came in 1939. As Hitler's armies moved across Poland, Britain once again needed speed. Factories reopened old blueprints. The Ministry of Works ordered tens of thousands more. In a matter of months, the Nissen returned, lighter, faster, refined with better bolts and pre-cut panels. Civil defense workers used them as bomb shelters during the Blitz. Coastal commands lined them along cliffs from Dover to Scapa Flow. Across the Atlantic, American naval observers took note. The United States was still neutral, but its engineers studied every British innovation: radar, degaussing cables, airfields, and these strange curved huts that seemed to rise overnight from mud and ruin. When the U.S. Navy finally entered the war after Pearl Harbor, it faced a logistical nightmare: hundreds of new bases across 2 oceans, from Iceland to Guadalcanal. They needed housing that could ship flat in a freighter and stand firm under monsoon or snow. So in early 1941, American engineers at Quonset Point Naval Air Station in Rhode Island began experimenting with a design inspired by the British Nissen. The result was the Quonset Hut, a half-cylinder of corrugated steel, 48 feet long, 16 wide, with plywood floors and end walls that could vary by climate. Within months, the US produced kits that could be stacked like cards, shipped anywhere, and built by sailors with nothing more than hammers and sweat. At first glance, it seemed a perfect copy, but hidden in its ribs lay a subtle difference. America's version traded the Nissen's delicate steel curves for heavier framing, more bolts, thicker insulation. It was designed for comfort as well as speed, a mobile home rather than a pure field shelter. The US Navy boasted that 10 men could build one in a day, yet British crews whispered that they could still raise a Nissen in 4 hours. As the war widened, both huts became silent icons of industrial war. On the icy shores of Iceland, British commandos warmed themselves beneath the original arches. In the Pacific, Quonset huts glowed under tropical sun, housing mechanics, medics, and chaplains. The shapes were the same: 2 nations united by necessity, but the spirit differed. The Nissen belonged to desperation and immediacy, the Quonset to abundance and permanence. By 1943, American production outpaced Britain's entire wartime output. Over 150,000 Quonset huts rolled from factories, stacked in endless convoys of corrugated steel. They covered the globe: Australia, North Africa, the Aleutians, Normandy. To the soldiers who slept inside them, they smelled of oil and hot dust, of home far from home. But among British engineers, a quiet pride lingered. The original still held the record. Nissen's design, born in the mud of 1916, could still outpace the might of American industry when time truly mattered. In an age defined by speed, it was ironic that the smaller island nation had built the faster shelter. The Nissen's genius lay not in what it added, but what it left out. No plywood floors, no insulation, no pretense of comfort. It was war reduced to geometry, the minimum metal to keep a man alive. As Allied planners met to build airfields across Europe, arguments sparked between British and American engineers. The Americans wanted comfort, the British demanded speed. Somewhere in that tension, the soul of wartime construction emerged, a debate not just about huts, but about how each nation fought its wars. Britain with scarcity and improvisation, America with scale and abundance. The corrugated ribs gleamed beneath searchlights, curving like the armor of a vast, sleeping beast. No one could know it yet, but these humble arches of steel would outlive empires, standing long after the guns fell silent, silent witnesses to the industrial age of total war. By 1942, the war had become a storm without horizon. Convoys stretched across the Atlantic, dark shapes vanishing into fog and fire. America was building faster than any nation in history. Ships, tanks, aircraft, entire bases appearing in weeks. But speed alone wasn't enough. Each soldier needed shelter, workshops, hospitals and command posts, all built on foreign soil where there was no infrastructure. The Quonset Hut became the answer to that impossible equation. Factories in Rhode Island, New Jersey, and California turned into vast seas of corrugated steel. Day and night, women riveters packed panels, bolts, and doors into numbered crates. Each hut came as a kit, everything labeled, everything precise. A blueprint inside showed how to raise it in 1,200 steps, no carpenters required. The first huts reached Britain in spring 1942, unloaded onto docks, still smoking from Luftwaffe raids. The British soldiers who watched the Americans assemble their first Quonsets were curious. They had grown up with Nissen Huts, knowing every curve, every bolt. They watched the American engineers lay down foundations, slot beams into connectors, raise arcs of steel into the air. The sound was familiar. Metal striking metal, bolts tightening, the echo of hammers. But something was different. The process was slower, more deliberate. The Americans stopped often to check blueprints, measure alignments, adjust angles. The Nissen crews didn't need drawings. They built from instinct, from memory burned into muscle by years of war. Within a day, the Quonset stood tall, a gleaming silver arch, more spacious than the Nissen, with insulation that softened the sound of the wind. Inside, wooden floors and electric lights gave a sense of comfort unknown to men who had slept in muddy trenches. It was warmer, quieter, easier to live in, but the British engineers smiled quietly. Yes, it was comfortable, but the Nissen could have gone up in half the time. The real test came when these huts met the war itself. In the tropics, Quonsets trapped heat like ovens. In Alaska, they froze solid, their plywood floors curling from moisture. In North Africa, sandstorms ripped their bolts loose. The Nissen huts, smaller and simpler, endured because they were designed for hardship, not comfort. They leaked, they rattled, but they could be built anywhere with fewer parts and fewer men. Yet America didn't slow down. The Navy ordered 50,000 more Quonset huts in 1943 alone. They became the backbone of every U.S. installation, from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal, from the Aleutians to North Africa. Each new base became a forest of curved roofs. Pilots slept under them. Surgeons performed operations inside them. Generals planned invasions at tables lit by humming lamps beneath those corrugated arcs. On the ground, the difference between the two huts told a deeper story. The British Nissen was born in desperation, a wartime invention stripped of luxury. The American Quonset was born from abundance, a design optimized not for survival, but for scale. One was made to endure suffering, the other to conquer continents. As 1943 turned to 1944, Allied engineers compared notes. British crews could raise 6 Nissen Huts in a single shift. American Seabees could build 3 Quonsets in the same time. But once complete, the Quonset's larger interior allowed double the capacity, better ventilation, and even space for offices or mess halls. Efficiency versus endurance, the two philosophies of the war itself. Still, on the front lines of Europe, when a new airfield had to be ready by morning, it was the Nissen that went up first. Quick, dirty, reliable. Its curved ribs became part of the landscape, blending into the grey skies and mud of the British countryside. American officers began to borrow the British design for emergency outposts, stripping down Quonset kits to mimic the older Hut's speed. By the time of the D-Day landings, the beaches of Normandy were lined with both, rows of silver arches catching the dawn light. To the soldiers storming ashore, they were symbols of safety, a roof waiting beyond the chaos. But to the engineers who built them, they were proof of something more profound, that even in the mechanized age, simplicity still outpaced power. In the ruins of Caen, a Nissen Hut rose beside a Quonset Hut, side by side amid the smoke and rubble. 2 designs, 2 nations, 1 purpose. Yet even then, some whispered that the Americans had lost something in the translation. The British instinct for minimalism, for building under fire, for valuing speed above comfort. And as the front lines pushed east, a quiet rivalry continued, unseen by generals and forgotten by history. The contest between the soldiers' shelter and the engineers' vision, between the hasty elegance of the Nissen and the industrial perfection of the Quonset. The huts had become more than steel and bolts. They were monuments to 2 ways of waging war, one born in the mud of the Somme, the other in the forges of Rhode Island. And though both would stand for decades to come, only one still carried the ghost of a man who, in 1916, had stared at a field of broken tents and decided that necessity was the mother of invention. By late 1944, the world had turned to iron and smoke. The Allies were everywhere, in the skies, on the seas, and crawling across continents under the weight of total war. Yet wherever they went, a familiar curved shadow followed them, the arch of corrugated steel that became the temporary spine of the free world. From the bombed fields of Normandy to the jungles of New Guinea, the Nissen and Quonset huts had become as recognizable as the uniforms of the men who lived within them. In the cold grey dawn over France, the beaches were still littered with wreckage from D-Day. But rising behind the dunes were the curved silhouettes of Nissen huts, built overnight by British engineers, their corrugated shells still wet with sea spray. Smoke curled from their chimneys as medics treated the wounded and signalmen sent out coded messages to London. These huts were crude, fast, temporary, and yet they saved lives every single day. Just a few miles inland, American Seabees were at work. Their Quonset huts gleamed under the sun, larger, broader, and built to last. Some served as command posts, with wooden desks, telephones, and maps spread across plywood tables. Others were converted into kitchens, barracks, or radar control stations. The difference between the 2 designs was clear even to the men inside. The Nissen was a shell against the storm, the Quonset a home in a hostile land. But the pace of war was merciless. The front lines moved faster than factories could ship materials. In Italy, Seabees found themselves short on bolts, improvising with local metal scraps. In the Ardennes, British engineers had to rebuild Nissen huts buried under snow. The very qualities that defined each hut began to show their limits. The Quonset's heavier materials slowed construction when speed was life. The Nissen's lighter frame buckled under repeated bombardment and snow loads. Still, both endured. Under the black skies of Antwerp, where V2 rockets screamed overhead, the curved roofs deflected shrapnel that might have torn through tents. In the Pacific, Quonset huts stood through typhoons and jungle rot, their plywood rotting but their steel bones unbroken. From Iceland to Okinawa, the hum of rain on corrugated metal became the lullaby of the Allied war machine. And yet a quiet truth remained among the engineers. The Nissen hut was still faster. Its simplicity was unmatched. Where the Quonset relied on prefabricated precision, the Nissen thrived on improvisation. British crews built them on cliffs, swamps, even floating pontoons. 6 men, a wrench, and half a day. That was all it took. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Reports circulated through the Allied command, comparing the two. The US engineers praised their Quonsets for comfort and durability. The British countered with raw numbers, speed, portability, and minimal logistics. A Nissen hut, one Royal engineer wrote, requires only 10% the packing space of a Quonset. In the endless equation of war, tonnage, man-hours, efficiency, that mattered. In the final push toward Germany, the huts formed the bones of the advancing armies. Behind every field headquarters, every airfield and depot, stood rows of those curved roofs. They seemed to rise from the earth itself, symbols of order in chaos. Even as cities burned, the huts stood, silent, steady, unyielding. In the Pacific, the Quonset huts took on new life. The Marines used them as air raid shelters and hospitals. Doctors performed surgeries inside them under flickering lanterns. Chaplains held Sunday Mass beneath their arches, the sound of the jungle mixing with prayer. They were not just shelters anymore. They were symbols of permanence amid destruction. Back in Europe, when the war drew to its frozen climax, British engineers built the last Nissen huts on the banks of the Rhine. The ground shook with artillery, the sky roared with aircraft, and yet they worked with calm precision. Bolts tightened, steel curved, structure complete. In 4 hours, another roof rose from ruin. The Americans arrived days later, hauling crates of Quonset parts. They built theirs too, in a single day, under the same smoke-filled sky. When they were done, 2 huts stood side by side again, one small and spare, the other large and refined. Soldiers from both nations shared a cigarette between them, staring at the curves that had become their second homes. The Nissen had been born from the desperation of one man on the Western Front. The Quonset had been born from the vast machinery of a nation at war. Together they had covered half the world. And yet, in the quiet before victory, engineers on both sides admitted something that would never make the history books. The British design was still faster, still simpler, still undefeated in the one thing that mattered most in war, the race against time. As Allied armies crossed into Germany, the huts followed, mobile towns of steel and sweat. They stood in ruined cities, beside airstrips, along rivers. They were temporary, yet eternal. The men who built them knew that when the war ended, these arches would remain. Silent monuments to a world that had learned to fight not just with weapons, but with ingenuity. And somewhere in the noise of victory, as the guns fell quiet, the ghost of Peter Nissen might have smiled. His idea, born in the mud of 1916, had outlived the empire that birthed it, copied by the most powerful nation on earth, yet never surpassed. When the guns finally stopped in 1945, the world was scarred and hollow. Cities were gone, nations shattered, and tens of millions were homeless. Across bombed Europe and the islands of the Pacific, the war's leftovers stood waiting. Not weapons or tanks, but rows of corrugated arches glinting in the sun. The Nissen and Quonset Huts, born for destruction, now became the architecture of survival. In the ruins of London, Nissen huts that once served as barracks were transformed into shelters for families whose homes had vanished in the Blitz. In Berlin and Warsaw, Quonset huts lined the streets like silver skeletons, their curved roofs reflecting the cold light of dawn. They became classrooms, workshops, and emergency hospitals. In Japan, children learned to read beneath the same arches that had once sheltered American soldiers. For the first time, the two designs stood side by side in peace. The British Nissen Hut, compact and efficient, suited the broken cities of Europe. The American Quonset, larger and sturdier, suited the sprawling reconstruction camps across Asia and the Pacific. They became symbols of something deeper, not power, but endurance. In post-war Britain, the government repurposed thousands of Nissen huts into temporary housing. Rows of them filled meadows and airfields, their tin walls echoing with the laughter of families. Some were insulated with cardboard, others with straw, but all carried the same promise, a roof, no matter how thin, over one's head. For people who had lost everything, that curve of steel was a kind of grace. Meanwhile, in America, the Quonset hut took on a second life. Surplus huts flooded the civilian market. Colleges turned them into classrooms. Farmers bought them for barns and tool sheds. Veterans built homes out of them, raising families inside those corrugated shells that had once faced enemy fire. Across the Midwest, highways shimmered with the gleam of recycled Quonset huts. The war's leftovers transformed into the backbone of peace. Yet, in the quiet halls of engineering, the comparison never ended. Reports were written, studies published, debates held. The conclusion was always the same. The Nissen Hut had been the faster, more efficient design, built for urgency, born from the immediacy of battle. The Quonset Hut, though heavier and slower to erect, had evolved into something more human, a shelter that could outlast war. Historians began to call them the twin icons of wartime architecture. Together they represented two nations' responses to the same problem, how to house men in chaos. The British had turned to simplicity, the Americans to abundance. Each reflected its creator's soul. By the 1950s, as Europe rebuilt, the Nissen huts began to vanish. Rust crept along their ribs, rain seeped through their bolts. One by one they were dismantled, their steel melted down for a new world. But in remote corners of Britain, a few survived, moss-covered, bent, yet still standing. Farmers used them for storage. Children played inside their shadows, unaware that these curved relics had once helped win a war. The Quonsets, however, refused to fade. Their strength, their size, their adaptability kept them alive. They spread beyond the military, to Antarctica, where explorers used them as research stations, to Africa, where they became schools and clinics, even to Hollywood, where they appeared in war films as the quintessential barrack of the 1940s. By the turn of the century, over 80,000 Quonset-style buildings were still standing around the world. But those who knew the story remembered where it began, with a single man, alone in the mud of 1916. Peter Norman Nissen never saw the full reach of his invention. He died in 1930, long before the world realized how far his curved roof would spread. Yet his idea survived, copied and transformed, shaping not just the war, but the peace that followed. When engineers today study wartime design, they still marvel at the Nissen Hut's efficiency. 6 men, 4 hours, 1 structure. No blueprint has ever beaten that. It remains a record of pure practicality, a testament to British ingenuity under fire. And so, while America's Quonset Huts came to symbolize the post-war boom, vast, strong, and global, the Nissen Hut remains the purer story. It was born of necessity, perfected by simplicity, and carried forward by nations that learned from it. Together, they remind us that even in war, creation and destruction walk hand in hand, that every bombed field and burned city can give birth to something enduring. Today, a few rusted huts still stand in silence, their curved ribs catching the fading light. They are relics not just of war, but of human resilience. Proof that genius does not always come from grand factories or massive armies, but from one mind determined to solve a problem under fire. The Nissen and the Quonset, 2 shapes, 1 legacy. From the trenches of the Somme to the beaches of Normandy, from the jungles of the Pacific to the far reaches of the Arctic, they sheltered millions, bridged continents, and outlasted empires. They were not beautiful, they were not glorious, but they were perfect.